talk about is logos. And logos is a Greek term. One of the things that a logos refers to in ancient Greek, it refers to kind of what you might call the structure and harmony of the world and the things in it. So when we think about logos, we can think about the fact that the world is intelligible. You know, we can, for example, in terms of physics, we can have a sense of the world starting with the Big Bang 13.7 billion years ago. And we can kind of have an idea of how the world developed from that Big Bang. And we can talk about the forces that keep things in relationship to each other. We can talk about sort of the structure of the universe and have an idea of how that works throughout time. And we can talk about our solar system and how all of the planets revolve around the sun in kind of an ordered pattern. They do that continuously. And you continue to push that and you realize that has to be the case for the Earth to be where it is, such that it could continue to foster life, so that life could continue to exist on Earth. And then even talking about living things, there has to be a lot of order and structure in living things in order for them to survive. So there has to be sufficient sunlight for plants. There has to be a nutritive soil. There has to be sufficient rain. And the trees have to have a certain organization within them such that their parts are able to collect that water, to have that capacity for photosynthesis, to convert the sunlight into energy, etc. So there's all sorts of ordered, structured patterns in the world that we see all around us. And it happens at a very deep level. Now, if you remember from the week 4 readings from Christopher Dunstan, he talks a lot about cosmos. Cosmos in this regard is very similar to logos. It refers to the ordered whole, right? That there's a deep order to things that often is not visible, often is hard to understand, but it seems to be something that allows for the universe to exist the way it does, and also to be something that we can intuit. We can have some kind of glimpse about, some little insight into. And another way we can think about logos is also referring to meaning. So that, like, think about it from this perspective. We know when somebody, says words that are jumbled and discombobulated and out of order, and it doesn't make sense, we say that is meaningless. And on the same token, when we hear something that is put together well, and you can see how it refers to something and it clarifies things, we'd say it's meaningful. Logos refers to the fact that the world is something that can be read and understood, similar to how a book can be read and understood. That we are able to see some meaningfulness in the world around us and respond to it. It's not just chaotic and totally incomprehensible, but it seems to have a deep meaning that we can understand. So that's the first thing I want to note about logos, is it's a reference to the world, the universe, in terms of a deep order, in terms of a meaning, in terms of an intelligibility and understandability, a comprehensibility. And that it's not something we impose on the universe, but something that we come to understand and come to see. Very similar again to cosmos and the deep order of things that Pieper talked about, that Dunstan talked about. Similar again to that quote from Gerard Manley Hopkins, the dearest freshness, deep down things, etc. All right, now that's one element of logos. A second element of logos that's also part of the Greek term is it refers not only to the things in the world, but also to the human mind. So here we're getting to this sense of logos as reason in the human mind. Now, logos as reason in the human mind, it has to do with the fact that our minds are rational. We have a capacity for understanding things. We have a capacity for thinking about them deeply, for coming to know things and put that knowledge together in an ordered format. So in that regard, we can of course think about terms like theology or biology. Biology referencing the study of life or the account that we give of life, and theology meaning the study of God or the account that we give of God. So theos in Greek means God, and logos, one of the things that logos means in Greek is study or account given by the human mind. So when we deeply come to know something and study it and speak about it in the right way, we're exercising our logos, our inner reason of our mind and words and language in the right way. And in that regard, so that's what we get when we do that study and thinking deeply into God. It's called theology, and that study and thinking deeply into life is called biology. Another way to say this is that the logos of the world, the deep harmony of the world, the structure, the pattern of the world, it aligns with the logos of our minds and vice versa. So that's a typo. That should say logos of the world aligns with logos of the mind. I apologize for the typo there. So it should say logos of the world aligns with logos of the mind and vice versa. As a matter of fact, I think I can actually, that should say, of course, that should say mind. I can actually write that in like that. There we go. Say mind. Logos of the world aligns with the logos. Yeah. Logos of the world aligns with logos of the mind and vice versa. There we go. We can actually have that. All right. That is the cool thing about PowerPoint. Okay. So there's a mirroring reflection, right? So that each mirrors the other. Each is a kind of the same sort of order as the other. It's the same pattern to some extent. And that's a kind of an odd idea, right? Because we usually think of the mind as its own thing and the world as another thing. But one of the notions that's been coming out in the past weeks, I would say, is the sense that there's a deep harmonious connection between the mind and the world. And one of the ways that we can articulate this is that the same sort of pattern or order that's in the world is also found in our minds and vice versa. It's hard to give analogies to this because it's a little bit of an abstract consideration. One of the ways we can do it, though, is to think mathematically. You can think about the ratio that obtains between different sets of numbers. So you could talk about how the number 5 is to the number 10, as the number 10 is to the number 20, and the number 20 is to the number 40. So it's a ratio of 1/2, right? So 5 is 1/2 of 10 is 1/2 of 20, and 20 is 1/2 of 40. But now if you can just play with this to stretch this analogy, you can imagine that there are different levels of your mind to some extent. Okay. And that's shouldn't be actually too much of a stretch. I think we kind of have an intuition about that. And you can say that the first level of your mind, where you have kind of a basic understanding, is half of the second level of your mind, which is half of the third level of your mind. So you can talk about there being kind of a similar structured pattern of your mind that's the same as the ratio that obtains in numbers. So it's the same ratio in different situations and contexts. The same ratio of 1/2, which ratio is reiterated several times over. That ratio is still there to some extent in how the mind works in its structured pattern, or its different levels, I'd say. That's just an analogy, but hopefully it's getting you just to think about this idea of logos in the mind and logos in the world lining up. Logos in the mind and logos in the world having a harmonious connection, working together, mirroring each other, etc. Now, the final thing I want to do when I talk about logos is to talk about it in connection to what we've been discussing over the last several weeks. And I've already hinted at it, but now I'm just going to bring it out into the open, which is the sense that the mind which is moved toward wonder and contemplation is one which ultimately goes toward logos. It is drawn to contemplate that deep order cosmos of the universe, right? So it's my mind coming to kind of connect with that in some very profound way. It has a almost it feels impelled to move in that direction. It can't help but want to have the encounter with the dearest freshness, deep down things. And that's when, as I was been mentioning the last several weeks, I think that's when the mind is at its best. And putting it in the terms that we're using today, it's the logos of the mind at its deepest or highest, depending on which is the better space vectoral metaphor. The logos of the mind at its deepest or its highest, encountering, coming to know, seeing clearly the logos of the world at its deepest and its highest. So the mind is interconnecting with the world and the world with the mind. There's a profound unity that's happening there, or mirroring, whatever the best metaphor might be. And that, of course, as we've been talking about, right, that requires work, that requires practice, requires patience. You have to sit quietly. There has to be a calm, receptive attitude. There has to be a radical openness of the mind to kind of enter into that relationship. What we're going to start seeing, though, is this notion that the mind has to have certain patterns in place in order to navigate that process well. All right. So this first slide is just getting us thinking about logos, but also in the sense that the mind is going to have to conform in some sense to a structured pattern in order to begin this process well of coming to know and unite with the deepest order of the universe. All right, so the term form is now what I want to kind of really dig into. Now, form, one easy way to start thinking about form, or perhaps clear way, is you can think about it as an ordered pattern. So you think about the blueprint of a house. It's just showing the layout of the house, how the house is going to be put together. And it's there even before the house is built, and it kind of guides the way the house is put together. Another term, of course, is design. You know, somebody who designs a car, or somebody who designs a city, or something of that sort, has that in mind even prior to the construction or the beginning of the process. A form is something that's obviously, of course, recognizable. You can see how the different parts go together. You can see how it would work. And the form is recognizable both in the planning stage and in the implementation stage, right? And in the final product stage. So if you think about the house, you know, a good architect is going to recognize this blueprint seems to work well for these reasons. And then as it's being constructed, the people on the crew who are putting the house together, who are constructing it, they can recognize that pattern as they're implementing it. And then it's the same design or pattern which is seen by somebody after the house is completed. So it's the same pattern both in the planning, implementation, and final stage. And different, it can be, like I said, it can be recognized. It can be, it also provides an identity to something. So the things that the house can be known as a certain type of house with a certain type of design, both when it's being planned and after it's been constructed. Obviously, the same goes for a car. And so the design of a car is there in the mind of the people planning it out, but it's a recognizable design and it can be known in the sort of car that it was designed to be. And so somebody can look at it and know it as a Toyota, or as a Ford, or whatever it is. A music analogy, music is also similar in this way because there are certain patterns to music. When if you ever, like with an orchestra, a lot of the instruments have to be playing together and they can't be each doing their own separate thing. There has to be some sort of overarching structure to it, or the whole thing is going to sound dissonant and discordant. And so people have to be coordinated together so that it produces a beautiful, harmonious sound. And that's, of course, what the job of the conductor is, to kind of keep everybody on the same page, as it were, and make sure that the first violins and the second violins and the violas and the cellos and the pianist are all playing in the right way together, and that there's got to be a pattern to this. And sometimes certain instruments are more emphasized than others. Sometimes certain instruments are quiet and other instruments take the foreground. Sometimes certain instruments are both playing loudly, but it works well together. Okay, so just and again, another thing you can look at is living things too, to some extent. Look at the shapes of living things and how their different parts kind of work together. So one analogy might be how a tree, it grows upward and then it has a canopy of its upper branches and its leaves, and it grows vertically and then it grows horizontally outward. And then the root system of a tree actually kind of mirrors that below the ground to some extent. And if you think about that, that's necessary for the survival of the tree, right? That the canopy is there to provide for the leaves that can collect the sunlight and the rain, water, and it helps the tree to survive. And then the root system, of course, doing the same thing below the ground so that it can collect nutrients and water from the soil. But there's a kind of pattern that is recognizable for different sorts of trees. And when we see that kind of pattern, we can know what type of tree it is. All right, now, what am I getting at here is the fact, it's similar to what I just had in the second slide, but it kind of reiterating some of these same points, that I used the term earlier of conforming the mind. The term form here is that what we're talking about is having the mind work properly so that it's not a jumbled mess. So it's not like a group of instruments that are not working together well. We want the different thoughts that we have, the different ideas that we have, to be properly formed the way that the instruments in a orchestra are formed together and the different parts of a tree are formed together to work in concert together, to align with each other, to interact in a properly patterned way, just as similar to how you want the parts of a house to be working well together, or the parts of a car. So if you think about thoughts or ideas as different parts of the mind, what we're starting to see is this notion that we need to get our thoughts in order, as it were, in an ordered pattern, in order to that they properly reflect the ordered pattern of the world. So if we go back to the previous slide, what we saw is that the logos of the mind reflects the logos of the world, and there's a mirroring image, or mirroring pattern going on there. Now we're starting to dig more into that and recognize that the ordered pattern of the mind has to be in place to some degree for us to be able to come to know the forms of the world and the patterns of the world. So we have to get our minds in good working order and on the right track, as it were, in order for us to enter into that deep contemplation and profound unitive knowing of the world. And if you don't, it's like a discordant mess of the mind. It's an unharmonious, random, chaotic mess of thoughts that aren't structured together in the right way to lead toward the possibility of having insight into the world. So what we're starting to see is there's a lot of kind of groundwork and basic work that has to be done for the mind to get in the right place to begin to contemplate the world in the right manner. And that's where we're starting to get into logic. All right, logic. It's a term we've all heard. There's, I'm sure, lots of connotations you have toward it. You've probably seen when someone's being logical or illogical. You have an intuition that certain things that you've read seem to be logical and some don't seem to be logical. On an initial overview, logic is a structured pattern of thought. Again, it's very analogous to the structured pattern of other things, like the structured pattern of a car or a house or an orchestra. The ideas that go together well, they fit. You can see the pattern. You can see how one thing leads to the next and leads to a next. All right. It's a recognizable pattern or structure. And you can also see when that's not there, just as you hear it in an orchestra where the different instruments aren't working together, or you see it in a house where the different parts aren't structured together well. It doesn't work. It doesn't fit. It's a kind of, it's messy. It's hard to navigate. It's hard to figure it out, etc. Just as I said earlier, when you have this logic of a structure and pattern of thought, and the ideas going together well, that leads to further insight. So you can build from it, just as when you're building a house, you can build the first story, the second story, and the third story. And every time, if you do that well, and it's strong and it's well supported, it can provide the basis for a second level, and then a third level, fourth level. Eventually, of course, you can get to the roof, and you can top it all off. The logic that we're talking about in terms of a structured pattern of thought also helps us to have the capacity with our mind to see the world clearly, so that our minds are lining up properly with the world. Just to reiterate this notion of mirroring the world or imaging or reflecting the world properly, we got to get our thoughts in order to have that kind of proper, clear seeing of the world around us. Another way to think about it, though, is logic as a structure and pattern. It acts kind of like, well, you can talk about a referee or the rules of a game, right? That in order to play a game like soccer, there has to be a certain field on which you're playing. There are certain lines. There's out of bounds lines. There's a halfway line. There's a penalty area, the penalty box. And if there weren't lines, you couldn't have an actual field on which to play. And there's rules about offside and fouling and when a goal is scored and how long it takes place. That also provides a structure, set of boundaries in which you play the game. And then the referee helps to ensure that the game is being played both within those rules and according to those rules. Logic is kind of similar. It provides a basic structure of thinking in a rule-bound way, so that if you can think about somebody trying to play soccer without out of bounds lines or without goal or offside or basic rules, you really wouldn't have much of a game. You'd just be kicking a ball and it wouldn't make a lot of sense and it wouldn't work together well, and things would be hard to recognize what the heck is happening, and you wouldn't know who's winning or losing or when the game ends or anything like that. And of course, holds for any other game: basketball, softball, hockey, etc. No matter what game you're playing, there have to be rules, there have to be boundaries, there has to be some sort of referee to enforce that, etc. Logic is similar in terms of what we might say playing with ideas in our minds, right? So the more we play with these ideas in our minds, we have to make sure that there's some sort of structured rule to them. They don't end up in a chaotic mess. They're not random. They're not all over the place. There's no proper procession to them. There's no way in which they kind of go in the right manner. The logic ensures that helps to provide rules and boundaries to keep us on track with our minds, as it were, to keep us playing with ideas in the right way, to keep our ideas in the right format, as it were, just as the referee helps to ensure that the game is played in the right way, in the right format. Another analogy is you can think about logic helps keeps our minds on the right path. If you've ever been walking in the woods, it's easy sometimes to think I'll take a shortcut here, I'll break off here, and it'll be an easier way to navigate the woods. It's very easy though to get lost in the woods, to get disoriented, to lose direction, to lose a sense of where you are. And it's quite necessary to actually stay well on the track or well on the path, and to have the map that tells you where you are, and obviously to have a compass with that, etc. What that's telling us is just a similar thing. Like, if I think logic is one of those things that helps keeps us on the path and this of our minds, and to flesh out that analogy just a tad bit more, once we do that well, the path might lead to a further insight where we have a deeper and more meaningful seeing of the world around us. And yeah, again, an articulate use of the mind to articulate the world around us. All right, and again, it's tough to teach this as an ASY class, because at this point I would stop and I'd say, are there any questions? Because I'm sure there are. If you do have questions, obviously you're along this, just please email me or come to my office, absolutely. But I'm going to keep going under the assumption that it's sufficiently clear at this point. The term argument. Okay, so just as logic has a precise meaning in this class, argument does as well. The term argument has to be understood in a very precise, specific manner, or else it's not gonna really work, as it were. So argument often means people screaming at each other, people shouting at each other, one person winning and another person losing. It seems to have like a strong emotional connotation. I feel it deeply, and I had to argue it. I had to argue this point. I'm forced to. All of those normal meanings of the term argument go out the window. They're not relevant. We're not going to think about argument in those terms. That's an unhelpful frame. So you just have to get rid of that normal sense of the term argument. What do I mean here in philosophy class? Well, it's basically a shorthand term for a logical form or pattern of thought. That's all it means. So when the mind is patterned well, and when our thoughts are in a good, proper format, when they're following a good pattern of one thought connecting well to another thought, connecting well to a third thought, that's when we're making use of arguments. So it's more just talking about the pattern or the structure or the form of our thoughts working together. And we'll see more how this plays out, but that's the first step of it. The logical thinking is done in philosophy. They say that logical thinking is often done when our thoughts are structured together well, and that kind of structured together well, where the parts are working together, the different thoughts are working together in a harmonious fashion, you just call that an argument. And it's calm and clear and thoughtful. It's not loud. It's not over the top. It's not aggressive. It's not mean. It's not overly emotional. It's just a different sense of the term argument. All right, let's give an example of an argument. This is just one I was writing the other day. So we can say philosophy is a practice that involves a deepening awareness of what is wonderful. Such awareness, however, does not come about immediately. It means being able to sit patiently and calmly with reality, such that the depths and meaning of reality might be glimpsed even if briefly. Only in response to a mind properly open and attuned can the wonder of the world be displayed. Thus, it makes sense that if someone wants to philosophize, that person should learn to be very patient and calm in beholding reality. Okay, so just to point out a couple of things. Hopefully you can see how these different thoughts or different sentences, which are kind of encapsulations of different thoughts, tie together, that they seem to connect, all right? And hopefully you can see how it leads toward a final thought. Hopefully you can get a glimpse of the fact that nothing is kind of out of place, that there seems to be a pattern to this. There should, I mean, at this point, you should get to the end and say, okay, I can see that there's a feeling it makes sense. Now we're going to try to articulate a little bit more what that's like, but just immediately, I'm asking you to sit with this so that you can kind of get a feel for how it makes sense and how the thoughts kind of tie together and work in a structured pattern. And let's go then to the next slide. Okay. All right. And I'm going to be going back and forth between this slide and the previous slide. So there's two terms. You have to just learn both of these terms, premises and conclusion. The conclusion is the end of the argument. It's what the argument is working toward. It's like the roof that completes the house. You've been building the house. Things have been put together well. You've had poured the foundation. You've made the first story of the house. You put up the siding. You've then put up the second story of the house. And you put up more siding. And then eventually you're going to cap it all off with a roof. That is the ending of the exterior construction of the house. Another way you could say it, it's the terminus of a train. It's where the last train station that a train stops at. All right, so a train's been going from point A to point B to point C, and then eventually it gets to D, and that's where it all ends. It's often indicated by terms like thus, or therefore, or in conclusion, or hence. All right. So just to go back to the previous slide, this final sentence right here is the conclusion of the argument. That is the sentence that wraps it all up, as it were, okay? That this sentence that begins with thus, it makes sense that if someone, that's the final thought, the concluding thought, obviously, the conclusion. It provides the final notion that you've been working toward the whole time, the final point that you've been trying to prove. That's what a conclusion is. So what are premises? Premises are like the foundations, the levels, and the siding of a house. They would build up toward the conclusion. They go together to work to the conclusion. There is a movement toward the stopping point. They're the motion of the train going toward the final stop. They're the train going from A to B to C, okay? And it leads to the conclusion in an ordered fashion. So going back to the previous slide, this last sentence, of course, is the conclusion, but the first sentence, the second sentence, the third sentence, and the fourth sentence are the premises. And hopefully you can see, as I said, to some extent, that each of these first four sentences, when taken together, help to show the final concluding sentence. They help to lead to it. You can see how this concluding sentence follows from the previous four sentences, that there's some kind of structure that these four sentences have that tie together, and you're like, all right, and as a result of that, we get to this conclusion. So that you can get a sense that these sentences each connect with one another, as it were. All right. And again, if we were in class, we'd spend more time because we'd have questions. I don't, unfortunately, in this format for the class. So I'm just going to have to leave it with the sense that at this point, you can kind of begin to, and again, this is just the beginning, you can begin to see what this actually is like. So premises and conclusion, just got to learn those terms. You got to make sure they're memorized. They have to be pretty clear in your head. All right. Now, this is another term that we have to learn. You have to learn the term inductive. All right. So we're going to learn this more next week too, but at this point, the first thing is to say that a type of argument or a type of logical structure of thinking, one type, the most common type that we often use is called inductive. And just a kind of initial overview of it, it's a bit informal. All right. It's not going to be as strict and rule bound as the other type of argument that we'll learn about next week. This argument here is an inductive argument. Just to kind of give you an example of it. It's a general approach. Okay, it's not going to be super specific. It's not going to be super exact. It's one of the analogies I was thinking of. It's a compass rather than a detailed specific map. All right, it leads to a further point or a conclusion that makes good sense, seems to follow, seems to work. But here's an important point. With an inductive argument, you're not trying to get something that's necessarily true. You're trying to get to something that's probably true or likely true. So probability rather than absolute certainty. It's or premises that lead to a likely conclusion, but they don't have to be the case absolutely speaking. Follows reasonably, or the conclusion follows reasonably from the premises. I'm sorry, that of course should be E. Conclusion follows reasonably from the premises. Okay, so what do we get? Let me try to explain this in a little bit more detail. Again, this one way to start thinking about it is if you have in a situations with math, examples from math, you might say, here's one, right? The Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. If you take the square of one of the legs of a triangle and you add it together with the square of the other leg of a right triangle, that will give you the square of the hypotenuse of the triangle. So if you think about it, one of the legs of a right angled triangle is 3 and the other leg is 4. Now, the square of 3 squared is 9. 3 times 3 is 9. And then you take the other leg of the right angled triangle, which is 4. 4 squared is 16. So then you add those two numbers, 9 and 16 together. And what do you get? Well, you get 25. So you know that the square root of 25 is the length of the hypotenuse of the triangle. What's the square root of 25? It's 5. So A squared plus B squared, B is 4, equals C squared, and C is 5. So you know what 5 is. And that kind of, you know what, I'll just actually, let me just see if I can do this. I can't draw it out. I was trying to draw it out, but I'm not going to be able to. In that instance, you have absolute certainty, right? You know that it has to be 5. If one of the legs of the triangle is 3 and the other is 4, then the hypotenuse has to be 5. It can't be anything different. Inductive arguments don't have that necessity or that certainty or that absolute nature. Okay, that's just kind of an important point to sit with. They do lead to conclusions that make sense. They follow reasonably. It's likely, it's probably. It's rational. Like, yeah, I can see where this is going. This here is an inductive argument. But I don't think anybody would have come to the end of that and said, okay, that's mathematical, that's absolutely necessary, it can't be otherwise. More likely, you came to it and you thought, oh, that makes sense. because that's what happens with a decent inductive argument. It makes good sense, but it's not necessarily absolutely true. Okay, so that's what, another thing to say to this is that inductive arguments are what we normally experience when we see logical structured patterns of thought that lead to conclusions. When there's a situation where someone's building up toward a conclusion by use of premises, more often than not, they're just making use of inductive arguments. That's what we normally have before us in everyday life. So let me give you another example. This is called an argument by analogy. So an inductive argument by analogy is an argument where you're comparing two things are being compared one to the other, and in that comparison, you're coming toward a further conclusion based on that comparison. So I'll just read it off and then we can kind of see how it works. All right, the sport of basketball demands a lot of practice and conditioning. For example, in order to become good at shooting free throws, you must work on them over and over again. Likewise, you have to work on drills with dribbling so that it becomes second nature for you to dribble the ball. In addition, you have to work out a lot so that you're in very good shape when it comes time to play actual games. Moreover, soccer is a sport that seems fairly similar to basketball. Hence, it follows that soccer, too, demands a lot of practice and conditioning. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, first thing to note, this final sentence is the conclusion, and the previous sentences are the premises. So it's very important to see that this is, first of all, of course, an argument, a logical structured pattern of thinking. And the two main parts of that are premises and a conclusion. And this final sentence is the conclusion, and the previous sentences are the premises. Premises are like the siding and the lower levels of a house. They're like the movement of a train toward the final stop. And the conclusion is like the roof of the house or the final stop of the train. So this is the last point, the main point you're trying to work toward. That's another way to say it. All right, so that's the first thing. Hopefully you're seeing that how this works as an argument, a logical structured pattern of thinking. And you can see the premises, and you make sure you can see the conclusion. The next thing to note is that you can see how this is an inductive argument, right? That you don't get to the end and sense this has to necessarily be the case. This is not a squared plus b squared equals c squared. This is not math. It seems to make sense. It seems to follow. It seems to work, but it doesn't have that absolute certainty. It's likely, probably, but not necessary. That's not necessary. So hopefully you can see A, how it's an argument, and B, how it's an inductive argument. Now, point C, I want to show how it's an argument by analogy. Because what's happening here is you have an argument where you say that basketball is similar to soccer. Basketball involves practice and conditioning. Insofar as soccer is similar to basketball, then it will also involve a lot of practice and conditioning. So you're taking basketball and soccer, you're comparing them, you're showing how basketball demands practice and conditioning, and that therefore, because soccer is a similar sport, it seems that would also involve practice and conditioning. So I just want to say a few more words on arguments by analogy. So here's a basic form or structure or pattern to this. A is like B, and A has features X, Y, and Z. Therefore, B likely has features X, Y, and Z or something similar. So again, A is like B, right? The analogy. That's what an analogy is. You're saying one thing is like another, one thing is similar to another, one thing is akin to another. And that is a basis for then further thoughts, insights, reflections, conclusions, etc. Then you're saying that, well, let's look at this more. A has certain features, X, Y, and Z, whatever they might be. In the case of basketball, it was conditioning and practice. And then you're saying, well, look, if B is like A and A has those features, then B probably has those features too. And then again, the case of soccer, which was the B, that was similar to basketball, which was the A in this case. Soccer would have the features of conditioning and practice, just similar to how basketball did. So in these cases, you're thinking more deeply into the comparison between two similar things. You're kind of fleshing that out. You're teasing it out. You're seeing what else follows insofar as these two things are similar to each other. And you're seeing whether connections or similarities might be the case. Okay, I'll wrap that up. I realize that is a fair amount of information. I want to reiterate a couple of things. Each of these terms, logos, logical, form, argument, premises and conclusion, inductive, argument by analogy, you just have to learn them. You have to memorize them. You have to think about them. You have to be able to apply them. You have to see when and how they apply, etc. You got to learn them like math. There's nothing else to say. And I'm going to give you more practice with this and we'll work toward the exam, but you got to get it down kind of ingrained within yourself. The other thing to say is start seeing if you can recognize arguments, if you can recognize the way in which someone's trying to put together a logical, structured pattern of thought that would lead toward a conclusion. See if you can see how someone is working in that manner toward a further point that follows from what has been said previously. So it's kind of like putting all of those things, seeing if you can recognize the design, the pattern, the structure, see if you can, and then see it, kind of reflect on yourself, try to put some arguments together, right? Where you're saying, all right, I'm going to try to make a particular minor point, prove it, demonstrate it, etc. And this is how I'm going to do it. That you got to do it over and over again in order to kind of get it down as it's a habit or a second nature. Okay, I think that's it for this lecture. Please, again, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will, try to learn this as best as you can, and good luck with week 5.